You think this raid looks like it will be easier or harder than Palace based on the mechanical difficulty tuning pending? No one knows. You can't know. Let's say this is a circle, kinda. So what is like the difficulty of a raid? Is it like, okay, this, oh fuck. Is it, let's make it a thicker brush here. Let's get this shit thick as fuck. Nope, that looks stupid. Okay, so bosses 1 through 8 isn't, okay, this isn't exact, but I feel like it's kind of this. It's like boss 8, it's boss 7, it's like boss 6, boss 5. Oh shit, I meant to move 5 up. Fuck, it's gonna annoy me that it's there, but it's fine. And then it's like 1 through 4. Maybe 1 through 4 are even smaller. But like this is like the, is this at least somewhat representative of like how hard a raid is for you guys? Race World first, totally diffy. But like for you guys, the pull counts usually make a lot more sense by the time you get there. 7 is half as big. See, I don't know. I feel like it's really common in most tiers for a cutting edge guild. Usually the last boss and the second to last boss are like the same difficulty. Like Tindral was just as hard as Fyrakk, and Stone Legion Generals was just as hard as Denathrius for most guilds. And Silken Cord is just as hard as Ansarek. And you know, Tindral, like it's all... Like, most of the time, I feel like the pull counts for the last 2 bosses are, like, really similar. What level guild are we talking about here for this scale? I don't really know. I'm kind of generalizing every guild that isn't the world first guilds, which is totally not fair and would make this very confusing. But, like, I don't know. Just like your average cutting edge guild, I guess. Something like that. Well, the reason I'm making it... Let's just say this chart isn't exactly accurate, but can we all hopefully agree that this is, like, not completely wrong and, like, somewhat relatable? Like 70% right. Like, there could be some stuff moved based on the races, but, like, we can all just be like, this is kind of how the difficulty is laid out. Okay, something like that. So, if that's true, then when you're asking me how hard a raid is going to be, this is why I can't answer you. Because unless I was, like, just thought I'm way smarter than I am, how the fuck could I ever tell you how hard I think the last boss is going to be? We haven't even seen it on Heroic. Like, you can read the Dungeon Journal all you want, but until you see how many times these things are happening and what the lineups look like and what the boss... You know what I'm saying? Like, you just... Like, if you're trying to imply how hard a boss is going to be, you're just fucking making it up. You're just making it up, right? So, how could you know? And that's almost half of the raid's entire difficulty is purely unknown. Like, completely unknown, right? And now let's talk about boss 7. A boss we actually... Or let's just say the penultimate boss, because sometimes there's not 8 bosses. The second to last boss, right? We see this one in testing, but what does that matter? We saw Stone Legion Generals in testing, completely different boss, way harder, worked way worse. It had like terrible issues with spell queuing and stuff. You see Tindral on PTR. We like basically kill that boss on PTR. We see it on live, and it's like 3 times the boss was on PTR. Just a completely different thing. Silken Court. Silken Court actually ended up being pretty challenging, but on testing, it looked like the hardest boss of all time. So I would have told you going out of testing that this is going to be like the hardest raid ever because the second to last boss... But the thing is, you know that these bosses change. They can get easier. They can get harder. Testing is not like the ideal interpretation of the boss, really. They're not done with it yet. So... And then even 5 and 6. Such a huge swing there, potentially, based on the raid, right? 6 could be Nexus Princess. It could be 300 pulls, which it wasn't for a lot of you. But like, for us, it could be... Brood Twister could be there, but then also those bosses could be completely irrelevant. They could be Fate Scribe. You just simply don't know. Tuning matters so much that, like, for all the raids that ended up being 2 weeks or in 1 reset, like no one, unless they're lying to you, like no one who does this could have told you how fast or short a boss was going to be until, or a raid was going to be until you do it, because there's just simply too many variables. The amount of bosses kind of doesn't matter, because like the more bosses doesn't mean there's more bosses like this. When there's 12 bosses, you get more of these. You don't get more of these. So it doesn't really change the total time, because these bosses can die fucking instantly, right? I guess your question was, do you think this raid's gonna be super hard? I have been saying something recently, and I'll kind of stick to that. Historically, when Blizzard... I'll do another paint. Fuck it. We're painting today. So if this is like... You know, here were raids in 2012 and 13 in Mist of Pandaria, right? So down here. Here's like the difficulty will be over here. I'm gonna end up drawing a dick. I fucking know it. But, like, here's like the raid bosses, right? So you have like bosses in MOP. And generally raids have just gotten like a little harder over time. All the way up until... the War Within, right? But every time there's been a jump like Tomb of Sargeras, it comes back down. You know? Anytime there's a super fucking hard raid, it's never like this. It's never, oh, raids are now just this hard and we just keep going from this point. There's always a rebound. Anytime there's a this, there's a that. There's a reflex. There is not like, oh, Tomb of Sargeras happened and now everything is hard again. That's just not how it works. So if you view that as we've been steadily progressing and then we got a Mirdrasil and then we got Nerebar Palace, it's a lot more likely historically in WoW for the difficulty to kind of revert back to this than it is to continue like that. But again, I'm just making shit up. It could just not happen that way too. But that is what I think is more likely than them continuing to make, because there's been a lot of feedback. And guys, I didn't make a dick. What about the last raid of Shadowlands with Crab Boss and Anduin? So Sepulchre's really interesting. I don't see Sepulchre as like a very, very difficult raid, even though it objectively was. Like, whether you go by the amount of time it took, or the amount of pull counts that it took, or how long the race took. On all of those metrics, it was a very, very hard raid. But it wasn't organically hard. So, like, when you do a really, really hard raid, and it's like the bosses just get crazy hard, but they're also, like, fair for you at that exact moment, and you can kill them, then it can be hard, but it, like, kind of makes sense. Sepulchre was just hard because they looked at the last couple bosses, and they were like, you need 2 legendaries for these. We're going to tune them for having 2 legendaries. And then because of that, the entire raid was crazy fucking hard because you were doing every boss with like less eye level than intended, because the eye level or power level they intended you to kill them with was something gated by 2 weeks of time. So you were fighting every boss with the ones you were killing were supposed to be killed with 2 legendaries, and you were able to do them without them. And then Jailer literally required them. So that's why the race took that long. I think if the bosses were not tuned with that in mind, I don't think it would. I mean, it's kind of like you're kind of splitting hairs, because I mean, like, that's bosses being overtuned is literally adding difficulty. So I'm kind of like, I guess, splitting hairs as to like what true difficulty is. But it didn't feel like the other way that other races are hard. It felt hard intentionally. It felt like they were intentionally adding difficulty through a tuning metric rather than just like every other raid. It just felt different than every other raid. I think the weekly buffing lets them make it really hard for you, but this Nerebar cutting edge is much easier than Fire Rack. Yeah, I think that's the idea. I think the raid buffs have been a universal success. It makes farm way easier for every other guild that's already done, and I think the guilds near the end of Cutting Edge generally could use these buffs. And I think it's going to be even easier in future tiers, because Silken Court is really unique in the fact where gear doesn't matter, and power level doesn't really matter. Like, it does in big chunks. Like when you log in one day and someone tells you, oh, hey, you can like burn this mechanic, you can burn and beat this mechanic set on Silken Court now. Okay, the boss just became easier. But until you hit those big thresholds of you can do this much damage now, your week to week damage increase based on the buff or the gear you're getting doesn't actually matter, because it's all just like binary movement stuff. Like, Silken Court is a boss designed for a stacking weekly or bi-weekly damage increase to give you the least amount of benefit possible. You just have to be good at the fight, because that other shit just like doesn't matter. You just have to be good enough at it. Where Ansurek, that buff makes it a joke. Like, the buff totally nerfs Ansurek. Most second to last bosses would also be nerfed heavily by that. Muggsy will be tremendously nerfed by the stacking raid buff. Galliwex, I can't really tell you, I haven't seen it yet, but like, Muggsy is not like Silken Court in that way. Like, doing more damage on Muggsy is going to be fucking insane. You're going to kill the goons faster, and you're going to see the last phase with more room available because you haven't had to do as many P1 phases. It's just objectively good. So I think it'll be even better in the future is basically my point. Silken Court felt harder than Queen, at least for my guild. Well, yeah, it's because of that, right? It's the same reason. Like, basically, depending on when, like, Ansurek is harder than Silken Court. It just is a harder fight. The difference is the stacking raid buff makes Ansurek way easier, and it doesn't really make Silken Court way easier. So Ansurek was a harder fight, but it was just naturally nerfed by the stacking raid buff, where Silken Court basically wasn't. Do you think Blizzard will do another Silken Court mechanic-like feature in the future? Is that a meme? Okay, well, I don't know if you're memeing or not. The meme would be, you know, that there's a boss in this next raid that is literally Silken Court. the Silken Court mechanic. The non-meme would be, I guess I'll inform you that there is a boss in the next raid that is literally doing... It's not necessarily the Silken Court mechanic, though, right? Like, Razageth did it. That old-ass Naxxramas boss did it, right? The whole, like, half the raid gets a certain polarization or color or something, and you have to interact in some way with that, right? That's not super uncommon. Thundering was kind of like that. Do you think they ever over or undertune whole raids unintentionally? Yeah. Yes. I think Aberrus was, in quotes, undertuned unintentionally, because I don't think it had anything to do with the tuning of the raids itself. It had to do with how much more gear. So in a week 1 of any patch, the Race to World First Guilds and basically every raid for the past like 4 or 5 years have about the same eye level. It changed a little bit with crests. Like now compared to before, it's a little higher than before. But the first time they released crests, they like overshot it. Like, you got way too much gear way too fast, to where we had about 6 more eye level than we normally do in the week 1 of any raid. I don't know if you guys have ever gotten 6 eye levels all in one jump before as an entire raid. Probably never. But that's a fucking massive power increase, like insane. And that is what we progressed Aberrus with. So a lot of people would tell you that like Aberrus was undertuned, and it's possible that it was. But one thing that, especially if you consider that like the gear you have and how hard the boss is tuned should be like the same, they should follow each other, and maybe they weren't able to follow how much gear we had. But I think they undertuned Aberrus on accident, because I genuinely don't think that they thought we would have that much gear. How is Blizzard to prepare for the amount of gear we can get with splits in a system they've never tried before? They have no idea how much we can do something like that, because even we don't, right? Like, you get an idea, you run some numbers, but it's like some crazy fucking spreadsheet shit. And even then, let's say Blizzard's like, well, of course Blizzard can do that, because they're going to see your damage on Rashok, and then they can tell how much single target you can do. Oh, really? Because we did Rashok before sending any upgrades. Oh, so you finally sent upgrades, and you're doing Skarn. It's not pure... Oh, or Magmarax, maybe. You're doing Magmarax. Of course they know how much damage you did. We still haven't sent every upgrade on Magmarax, and even then, our main players haven't even had any time to do Mythic Plus yet. So then they're tuning for these metrics of like whenever we're done with gear, but they don't actually know when we're done, and we're typically not done till the end of the week. So Muggsy looks rough. The last testing of Muggsy was pretty easy, but then they also buffed it afterwards. But also, like, a boss being easy on testing is like we have seen 2 things happen in back-to-back raids. We have seen Tindral be one of the easiest second to last boss testings of all time, and it ended up being probably the hardest second to last boss of all time. And then we saw Silken Court be easily the hardest testing boss of all time ever. Harder than any boss ever on testing Silken Court. And then it ended up being a like relatively easy second to last boss, at least in the race. So like you just don't know, man. You just don't know. Halandris was easy on testing? Bro. Okay, Halandris actually wasn't easy on Mythic testing. But Halandris, it's important to note that Halandris was a completely different boss on testing. It had Odin runes. It literally a completely different fight. The things on the edge of the room were... The boss started with an 80% damage reduction, and you had to kill these batteries to do damage to him. It was a completely different fight.